The historical origins of society form a preserve for archaeologists into which I will not intrude. But for philosophers, things have also a logical origin, in that their structure and life may presuppose and complicate simpler structures, whether these actually pre-existed separately or not. In this sense, a too curious school of transcendentalists maintains that society never had an origin, because nothing can exist except by virtue of its social bonds. Figuratively, indeed, all existential relations may be called social, for events owe their being to previous events, and things once formed can preserve their existence only by resisting or complying with the present pressure of the neighbors. Something without neighbors, without antecedents or consequence, or a position in natural space or time, would not exist. It would not be a part of the world, but a mere essence. It would dwell only in the immutable society of all other possibilities. This baptismal bond of coexistence among all things that are to exist in the same world is sometimes exaggerated by saying that things are nothing but their relations to one another, and that morally, too, a man is nothing but the functions he exercises in society. I think, however, that if a man were not first something intrinsically, he could never be found in forced relations to anything else. What he is in himself, his essence, has indeed inescapable ideal relations to other essences, as a straight line is essentially distinguished by its constancy and direction from all curves that essentially change their direction at each point. These ideal, eternal relations suffice to give character to straight line and make it discoverable, if it ever exists or seems to exist. But the definition does not produce any cases of it. In order to acquire existence, that essence has to be found, or to find itself, in a mesh of relations that are not ideal and inevitable, not possibilities eternally collateral to its own essence, but extraneous, accidental, variable relations, the surprise and pressure and inconstancy of which prove that it has been born into this world, and compelled for a time to cut a figure there, precariously, confusingly, treacherously, and perhaps painfully. It is this second inconstant realm of being that we call existence. But so far is our accidental and changing position in it from being our essence, that it is the violence and groundlessness of that position that prove to us the terrible paradox that we exist. Vital freedom is simply life undivided and unimpeded. Far from hanging on the groundless choice of an empty spirit, such freedom presupposes a natural organism with determinate impulses and capacities. Nor is this psyche like the mind of literary psychology, a tabula rasa, or clean piece of paper, miraculously adhesive, such that flying phenomena might sometimes stick to it, or at least leave marks upon it if their contact to constitute, respectively, perception and reflection. Such a passive sensorium, even if we assume that it felt these impressions, will have no faculty of comparing or regrouping them so as to think, nor would it have any means of linking them with action or weighting them with animal interest, as they are weighted in human discourse. Before a significant discourse or vital liberty can make their appearance, living creatures must have arisen with a congenital tendency to grow and develop its action in particular directions. In so far as any creature is able to do so, it is vitally free. In so far as circumstances, instead of allowing and feeding such native movements, which we call life, impede or prevent them, the creature struggles under compulsions, prohibitions, and conflicts that defeat its natural free will, or confuse and deflect it, or finally crush it out altogether. In man, however, this natural free will is seldom perfectly unified. When the psyche is highly complex and sensitive to many different influences, it pursues now one good, now another. Where impulses dominate by turns, the creature seems merely versatile. But when several impulses or passions persist together, the man vacillates, feels that he contradicts himself, each element in him hating and spoiling the others. Then, when a particular character and profession is adopted by him officially, other affections may secretly survive, and his whole life may be embittered by forced virtues that he feels to be his enemies and disgraced by vices that he dares not call his friends. Then suddenly, perhaps, the tables may be turned. In the name of vital liberty, he may publish to the world that his only vice, and the ruling vice of society, has been hypocrisy, that his suppressed passions and thoughts were all legitimate and amiable, that freedom is the root not only of genuine virtue but of universal sympathy and justice, and that all nature and all history are animated equally by the spirit of life. The glory of this proclamation, however, is likely to be short-lived. Vital liberty is indeed the essence of all genuine virtues, but these virtues must be opportune. They must be compatible in each man and in each society. And the freer reign they all have indiscriminately in the jungle, the more cruel the survivors among them will seem to the miscellaneous multitude of innocents that will be sacrificed. Simple animals enjoy vital freedom by nature. A complex animal can recover it only by achieving moral integrity. He needs to become a disciple of Socrates and learn to live by the knowledge of his radical self and of his total circumstances. Unfortunately, so complex an animal as man has prolonged to similar phases in his moral being, and probable various societies or careers requiring of him divergent developments. Has he any true self? Has he any fixed, authoritative, trustworthy environment? Has he to earn his living? Or if not yet, he is dragooned into a crude and intolerant regiment of youngsters, where everything is prescribed, or else by a regiment of pedagogues, where everything is forbidden. If he is a favorite of fortune, he either becomes the slave of convention, or the sport of every accidental temptation to be free, not in the exercise of his veritable natural powers, but in miscellaneous experiments and tiresome adventures. As he grows older, his possibilities will be slowly buried under the crust of his habits. He has no vital liberty, but can't help going on in his old round. Yet under all these masks and incrustations, there still lives a human being that had other potentialities, and the fact that they slumber in him as if unborn is betrayed by the impatience he feels at being so perpetually bored, so perpetually driven to do this thing and that, which are notoriously not worthwhile. He's not even the victim of a master passion in which, however tragically, one ray of vital liberty might have found its way out. He has never had a chance to become himself, but has suffered from a pervasive cramp by which a part of his psyche, like a cancer, has paralyzed the whole. Could there be liberty before anything existed? Or could anything exist without being something in particular? Could anything possessing a particular character exist if it did not find itself surrounded by a particular world? This reflection appears to exclude a kind of bottomless initiative which people are sometimes tempted to attribute to themselves. It is not merely that they are not held down by any obstacle and can jump in any direction from the spot where they stand. That would be simply the vacuous freedom that, at least logically, surrounds anything existent. It might conceivably change in any one of an infinite multitude of ways. I am thinking of something more intimate, of the root of freedom in oneself. In this inner freedom, all vital, all the onrush of movements already afoot, a contingent automatism, Is this inner freedom all vital, all the onrush of movements already afoot, a contingent automatism? Or is there here also a sphere of vacuous liberty surrounding the kernel of organic life? In lazy thinking, for instance, a given train of images or words may be arbitrarily crossed by an image or word absolutely irrelevant. Yet if you notice the intrusion, your mental life has been deflected in a way that, in some cases, might prove important. The intruding word or image might be attributed to the grace of God or to a temptation by a devil, or might it, and this is the point in question, be attributed to one's own absolute freedom? In other words, can what seems absolutely groundless have its ground in one's unconscious choice of it out of the infinite realm of vacant possibilities? I may seem to be relapsing into the vain controversies of other days concerning free will and necessity, but though my arguments may be of that ilk, my subject and aim are wholly different. Of causes or necessity I do not speak, nor am I interested in attaching blame to anybody or in escaping it. Blame is not a philosophical category. Everything existent seems to me equally contingent, including the uniformities that we may think we trace in nature or in human habit. Everything of that sort might have been different, or may become different. I am concerned only with the nature of that kind of liberty which society and government may notoriously grant or deny to the individual. When, in what sense, in what relations, is it possible to be free? The conclusion to which I am led is that this possible liberty is exclusively vital. That is, it lies in the exercise of the instincts or gifts with which the individual finds himself endowed. Vacuous liberty to exercise other faculties, which he has no gift for, is no benefit to him, rather an evil, because by the power of suggestion, fashion, or vanity, he may be tempted to profess interests which are not his own, and to neglect his true capacity and moral advantage. And his social duty in this respect is to do to others as he would have them to do him, to impose no alien or artificial virtues upon them, and to afford them the greatest scope possible for developing their ingrained disposition and powers. It makes no difference whether a man's bent is innate or acquired, provided it be acquired organically, so that his inner life adopts it and he lives spontaneously and happily in following that acquired bent. Education may therefore serve to awaken latent or congenial capacities, and to train them. So far it is truly education, or the bringing out of the vital nature of man. But instruction and training are worse than wasted if they bore or distract the child with profitless tasks, and perhaps disgust him with all concentration and discipline. It is under such unhappy influences or in sheer abandonment that a man may imagine that his true self is infinite and indeterminate, that it is always something new and unimagined that he really longs for, so that if only he had complete vacuous freedom before him, he would be a sublime genius or even God in person. His politics will then be anarchical. He will deprecate all definiteness in custom, law, science, or art, and think that by fishing uneducated in the vacuous infinite, he may expect to draw a miraculous catch. Meantime, if he does not become a criminal, he will be little better than a madman. Now madness, or an originality for which there is no thoroughfare in the world, may by chance be exciting and wonderful in itself, like an opium dream, but politically and morally, or even hygienically, it is a misfortune. In some other world it might be virtue to cultivate that form of life, but in this world, and for a human being, it is a vice. The turn by which a human psyche developed that vice was an instance of liberty misplaced. True and vital liberty for that psyche would have developed ways of living rooted in itself, impossible at the place and time in which it found itself, even the cultivation of ways of living impracticable in the circumstances of the moment, but rooted in the psyche, though tragic, would not be insane. It might even be heroic. On the other hand, the current ways of life, if contrary to the innate bent of the individual, make social existence for him a veritable servitude. It follows that the vacuous infinite is not a source of freedom in any case. That which a being morally and vitally vacuous may draw from chaos transforms intuition without either liberating or satisfying the soul. It begins a new chapter, which may be happy or unhappy in itself, as a dream may be, but does not belong to the same story as the man's life in the world. It is always in that background, an accident and a defect in composition. The root of freedom is always the will already alive, the person already possessing definite interests and tastes. If accidents intervene from the irrelevant infinite, they do not enlarge liberty, but renew fatality. The root of freedom is nature. There is one element in imagination, as in all mental things, which is immaterial, namely, consciousness. But consciousness, a cognitive and synthetic function of pure spirit, is similar in all instances of it, and contains no ground for its own existence, much less for the various qualities and movements of its objects. The qualities and movements of material things, however, as we shall see in the fourth book, do supply a natural ground for the existence of consciousness, and for its varying intensity and scope. They also contain the only possible explanation of their own variations, which, as exploration proceeds, appear more and more minute, complex, calculable, and continuous. The existence and flow of imagination are controlled by matter. Imagination, in its beginnings, is continuous with perception, as the waves, says Hobbes, after the wind dies down, give not over rolling. So sense, after the object is removed, retains its motion, and fancy is decaying sense. Yet this connection of imagination with the external world, obvious in the beginning, is soon lost and obscured, owing to the hidden cerebral labyrinth in which the currents which carry imagination with them meet. It therefore seems after a little that the course of imagination has nothing any longer to do with what is happening in the world of matter, and its liveliness and fecundity are attributed to the will, or to genius, or to chance, or to some other pompous synonym for ignorance. Youth, love, and wine, however, are all well known to quicken the imagination, and opiates to swell it and make it monstrous, while hard labor and a sound digestion quiet it, and fatigue and aesthetics may arrest it altogether. These indications are telling, and ingenious observers can succeed in tracing almost all the figments and vicissitudes of the fancy to some prototype or impulse in the material world. Dreams, they say, are guided by profound and torturous passions, which during waking life are relegated to the background or suppressed altogether. And it looks as if in each man there were several levels of ideation and several types of character, which may be suspended or renewed alternately, with comparatively little intermingling of their currents. It is to these submerged lives within that a life wedding eloquence, intention, conversion, and madness may be traced, as well as voluptuous reveries, fictions, revelations, and dreams. The wealth of the imagination is thus seen to be greater even in plain men than hasty convention supposes, but no advance is made in understanding the mechanism of the objects that appear in these various fields of ideation. To attribute them to the passions or interests which they entertain is idle, for what then institutes these passions or directs them in the choice of their objects? It is pure verbiage to attribute ideas to a tendency to form those ideas. Either the ideas have no ground, or the tendency that produces them must be the operation of some object or organ otherwise discoverable. These objects or organs can, up to a certain point, be found in early surroundings, startling accidents, sex, etc., but the thread of objective causes is soon lost. The words are vague physiological analogies, have to supply the place of precise knowledge. How, for instance, does sex operate on the imagination? The conventional account of this mystery and psychology here is little more than convention, would be that nature has attached pleasure to certain contacts and to certain images, that what is pleasant is retained if possible in consciousness, and that erotic reveries and dreams obey this interest in keeping pleasant images and sensations before us. But errors and inversions of fact simply saturate this account. Nature has not attached pleasure to any contacts or images taken in themselves. Whether these objects are pleasant is due entirely to other circumstances, such as the ripeness and momentary activity of sexual impulses. The very same image and contact being annoying or indifferent or repulsive, according to the residual underlying mood of the man. Even the acme of sexual experience itself may be almost pleasureless, when it is not craved or is crossed by alien preoccupations. And as to images, the light of pleasure plays upon them most inconstantly and only in occasional moments, like the spell of beauty. Actually felt, the power to stimulate lust is inconstantly and only in occasional moments. Like the spell of beauty actually felt, the power to stimulate lust is a most adventitious property coming to them from without, and like reputation, according to Iago, got without merit and lost without deserving. Nature has attached no pleasure to any specific object, but pleasures involved in profound and untraced reactions of the body. When they happen to be set in motion, when some image is before the mind, suffuse it for a moment, and the poor idolater may afterwards fancy these images have pleasure to give, while it was the warmth of his own blood that, by chance, lent them all their charm. And when the blood has thoroughly cooled, while cohorts of Horus will not warm it, so as to make themselves seem beautiful again, we must remember, too, how arbitrary the qualities are that arouse desire. The charm of youth and bloom, for instance, is sometimes overwhelming, and it is far more closely related to probable fertility than to sensual pleasure. So that if these qualities please, it is because they stimulate passionate desire, and if they stimulate it, it is because, by their physical operation, they are already found to excite sexual reaction. The whole conventional introspective view of such a matter is accordingly foolish and merely rhetorical. The hold which any image has on the soul in its basis and substance, the hold which one material object has on another. If my hand is caught in the wheels of a machine, the fact that my attention is chained to these objects is not referred even by the silliest of idealists to a genius on my part, spontaneously interested in imagining such a situation. Yet that would be the only consistent view for the rhetorical psychologist, since when my brain is electrified by erotic effluence of some passing body, because the material meshes in which I am caught are less visible, he tells me that my sinful attention spontaneously selects that image, and that my secret pleasure tempts me to keep it in mind, no matter how cruel and distracting I may actually find that obsession. Nevertheless, the moment of fancy is so vigorous and incalculable, and it seems often so irrelevant to the surrounding facts of nature, for perception and imagination run on side by side, that mankind has always supposed that the mind had a life of its own. People have supposed that the soul is a separable substance, or that mental life moved on an independent plane of existence, parallel to the plane of matter. How natural this illusion is appears in the superstitions of savages, who all believe that souls of their enemies and of their relations survive their bodies, at least for a time, and continue feebly to exercise their malign and sneaking influence. For while the world of imagination is reputed to be a separate stream of being, it is not, except in the theory of a few philosophers, cut off from influence on the material world. On the contrary, just as it takes from nature themes for mental elaboration, so it is thought to impose on nature its designs when formed, and the material and the mental flux people think influences one another, but hardly in the same sense, since mind draws its materials from nature only by a kind of reproduction or of sensuous photography, while it bestows on nature new forms at will by a kind of magic. This barbarous commerce is still admitted in popular psychology, and on the same level the belief in surviving ghosts, in groundless ideation, and in creative will flourish congenially together. Now the objects given in animal perception are not ideas. Sensible qualities are predictable of the objects, and not of the consciousness of them. What is hot is the fire, not the mind that perceives the heat. How then should the very same qualities present in imagination or in dreams become qualities of the mind? The object that wears these qualities, if there is one, must be of the same sphere as the material objects in which these qualities were originally found. Let such a material object seem not to exist behind the images of the fancy, which, though both inadequate and redundant, is unmistakable, and sufficient for significant reference of the visionary appearance to the mechanical reality. The problem is thus raised to a much higher generality, when we consider that even in perception the immediate ground of our perception is in the brain, not in the perceived object, and that the quality attributed to the object by sense is not always present in it bodily, but is often a fanciful translation of some relation or some dynamic process subsisting between the object and our bodies. Now in fancy too the brain is undoubtedly active, and therefore the same ground for ideation exists as in the case of external impressions, while the non-existence of an object such as is imagined is only an exaggerated instance of the non-existence of an object exactly such as is perceived. In both cases there is a real object inadequately and redundantly presented, but in fancy and particularly in dreams this inadequacy and redundancy are extreme, so that we may say there is little relevance left between the natural causes of the dream and the aesthetic essences it discloses, while in the case of perception this relevance is considerable, though far from entire. Accordingly, reveries, thoughts, plans, dreams can have none but a material basis, although we are ignorant of what this basis is in its middle course, so to speak. We see its extremities, and the determining influence of blood, sex, age, and environment on the one hand, and on the other in the motor tendency and the artistic expression in which imagination invariably issues. I watch the landscape, and it is admitted that here the image is visible to me, as the clouds gather or the trees sway, vary with the changes in the material object, and because of them, it is further known that I should not perceive these external changes, go on as they might, if I had cataracts in my eyes or a lesion in my brain. The immediate ground is therefore not the mere existence of the object, but its operation upon the inner parts of my body. Later, by my fireside, I see those clouds and swaying branches again, or rather a half-formed, ill-focused, fugitive ghost of them. But my sense of their identity, my recognition of their presence, is far surer than my memory of their exact aspect. What does this mean? That the immediate ground of my former perceptions, the effect the objects produced in my brain, has been partly reformed within me, nervous processes being very mobile and quick to acquire habits, and especially that the motor attitudes and general reverberations of those impressions is almost exactly renewed. Nay, sometimes it is not until the images are recalled in reverie that the full sentiment and magic of them is felt. That is, in the haste of actual perception, other stimulations interfere with the full digestion of what the eyes drink in. But at a moment when impressions are less crowded and loud, the whole system settles, as it were, around the revived moment, and the imagination grows poetical, moral, total, warm. But what now? I find myself, pencil in hand, reproducing with emotion the curves of these trees and clouds, bringing them, though in a qualified form, with the unconscious bias of my temperament, and with my sign upon them, the material shape again before me, and before all men draw upon a sheet of paper. This drawing, let me observe, is no copy of the image actually flickering in my mind's eye. It is a tentative, surprising creation of the hand, far more complex and true than that unseizable image. All I can do is, as I draw, to say, like a bystander, yes, yes, or no, no, to my gradual, miraculous reproduction of what I had once seen, but see no longer. That is, I recognize the object more easily than I imagine it, and I reproduce it more fully and accurately than I recall it. What is the meaning of this? Evidently that the trees and clouds soaked my body in their subtle but manifold emanations, and bent and predisposed it to random imitative reactions, and that to this body enacting of the objects before me, this mimicry of my environment by my whole organism, original perception, later imagination, poetic emotion, and artistic impulse were all incidental. How this profound and pervasive, but almost insensible imitation of all things by the sensitive body occurs, I am at a loss to conceive. I beg the physicists and physiologists to make some effort to tell us. But I am aware of it in myself. I observe it in others, especially as time subdues them to the element in which they live, and the very existence of imitative arts proves it, I think, beyond cavil. The imagination, while we labor, is an accompanying observation of images that come unbidden, that change, vanish, and reappear as the artist's work proceeds, according to the dryness or exuberance of his momentary condition, his freshness, fatigue, or incidental excitement, for any stimulus stimulates the whole brain. Nothing could be more false and superficial than to suppose that the given images govern the work, and are themselves groundless or voluntary. To choose my images, I should need to possess them already, so as to know what I wanted. But why do I possess those I do, and not other and better ones? And why do I wish to summon or focus any of those I have? All that can be said is that the body presents these images and no others, and that the body knits itself together to enact this impulse and not that. Man's body is his genius.